right. I need some more coffee.
We're not going to broadcast for 8 hours. All right. Hey, how's it going? I know nobody's watching right now at the moment, but maybe some people will drop in. If not, this. Oh, sorry. There, I had to mute my own stream. So, but this will be on podcast later. So I know some people listened to that and found that useful. So welcome to my live stream / podcast feed. And today I have my friend, Matthew Facciani. Matthew, I've known you for years. You've let me post stuff on your, Pathos blog. I think we've only ran into each other once, maybe at Reason Rally, but it's always good to interact with you. So how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on. It's good to chat with you again.
Oh yeah, it's always good. Yeah, I love interacting with you, talking to you about science and diversity. And you've done a lot of different things, and including like activism. We have this parallel where we both work on science, though I guess you're working on the social science and I work on the quote unquote term I dread, like the hard science. And
yeah. No worries.
It's weird that we don't see, I guess we don't see a lot of hard sciences, quote unquote, like actually interested in this type of diversity stuff. But I think it is important. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it.
Yeah, and before we get into what we're going to talk about today, your research is actually, if I'm not mistaken, it's focused on how people change their minds in politics and stuff like that. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, broadly, that's what I'm interested in, is how we can look at different ways to reduce bias and reduce polarization so we can process information a little bit more objectively.
Oh, that's perfect. That's sort of exactly what we're talking about. Before we go into that, what's like an example of something, like maybe something pithy that people would find interesting that you're investigating?
Gosh, there's so many things. Well, you just sent me that article about the sports teams. And I think that one's such a clear-cut example to really get at the heart of the issue, because it's not even going into politics or religion. It's literally this study that was done, what was it? I think in the 50s, or 60s maybe. It was a while ago. I don't know if it's like a paradigmatic like case study. Yeah, but it's been replicated many times, the idea of in-group and out-group bias. And basically that was more of a case study, the one that you were talking about. It was the idea that Dartmouth students and Princeton students both watched film from a football game of their respected colleges. And even though they were watching the same film, they saw much more penalties from the out group. And this like automatic processing of information differently, seeing the same play, but saying, hey, there was holding on that play, that should have been a penalty because it was the other guy that did it. And then when the other school watches it, they're like, hey, that guy didn't do anything wrong. Why do they call a penalty? So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually pulling up the study now. The study is titled Case Reports They Saw a Game, a Case Study by Albert H. Hastorf and Hadley Cantrill. I can't see what journal this was in. Maybe it wasn't in a journal, but I'm slightly biased towards the Dartmouth team because I'm just looking at this and like I think Princeton is just a bunch of piss babies, because when you look at the actual table, Dartmouth seems pretty even-handed, and Princeton is like, wow, we got twice as many fouls against us in this game. I don't know.
Yeah, you dive into it. That's pretty funny.
No, from what I understand, I was thinking of covering diversity first, but this is so natural. We'll talk about, skepticism and in-group biases. Sure. From what I understand, humans are kind of stupid, and we in-group and tribal thinking is almost a universal, just a universal phenomenon, no matter who you are and who engages with it, and it can come up for like all sorts of arbitrary things, like what color shirt you're wearing or something like this, or what school district you happen to attend school in, things like that, like completely arbitrary things.
It's amazing.
Am I correct in that assessment? And like, if so, like, can you speak to the universality of in-group and out-group thinking?
Yeah, in psychology and the social sciences, we don't really have a lot of laws, but I would say it's one of the closest laws you have in social psychology is the in-group, out-group bias, because the findings are just so robust and so well replicated. Like, you know, I think we've talked about like some of the replication issues in social psychology, or you might have seen some of it. Like, there's definitely some wonky stuff out there, but there's clear basic in-group, out-group biases that we see replicated time and time again. This cognitive preference to instantly delineate between two social groups or more that pop up, and it's just been studied in all sorts of different contexts: sports teams, politics, religion. You mentioned area codes. You can experimentally induce it so quickly by just telling people that they had a particular appreciation of like an art style versus another art style, then automatically those two people like think they're in different groups. It's amazing, just these basic social lines that we draw so quickly, and then once those are drawn, it influences how we see the other side. And the stronger we dislike the other side, or the greater difference we see between the two sides, the more biased we're going to be in processing information.
Right. So you and I both, at least in principle, identify with some sort of skepticism. And I think the line or the line of thought that a lot of skeptics go by is just, maybe it's just virtue signaling or something, but they'll just say, we need to not think tribally. We just need to not behave in a team sports manner. And in that sense, a lot of skeptics think they're sort of above that all of that. And like, based on what you're saying, it's so universal. There's almost, there's no way they can be above that above all this, you know, some sort of evolutionary programming that's been put into us after, you know, millions of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And someone actually mentioned this on a Facebook post of mine, the idea of how that virtue signaling can impact future behavior, because what it's doing is giving yourself like an affirmation boost of, I am doing this good thing, basically what you're saying. And it can apply to lots of different attitudes, skepticism, social justice, being pro-religion if you're in a religious subgroup. But the idea that you have done your pro-moral behavior, and then once you do that, we tend to kind of revert back to maybe not, we don't think we have to work as hard after we do that. So the classic study looked at people who just went to church and analyzed their behavior afterwards. And we actually see a spike in people behaving pretty immorally right after they came from church, because
not tipping their waiter.
Not tipping their waiter. Yeah, that's one of the classic studies that we see that, hey, I did my good deed today. You know, I don't have to worry about this. And it's very common. And the idea relates to, I think, a secondary, what I would say, close to a psychological law, is the need for consistency. That just happens all the time with cognitive dissonance, with different types of dissonance. We don't like seeing things that mismatch. That's something human brains do not like. So there's a lot of theoretical work looking at how that applies to affective attitudes too. So whenever we do something really good, we want to cancel out just unconsciously by doing something maybe not so good. We did our good deed. Now we don't have to keep it going. Boom, we're back at baseline. And it can be a problem, relating back to your original point, if we say like, well, I'm super unbiased, so I'm going to go and tell everyone I don't fall into tribalism. Now, now that you've done that, you've elevated your sense of thinking that you're above, any sort of subjective bias, and then you might, the very next tweet could be very subjectively biased. So yeah, absolutely.
It seems like there's two tribes, a tribe that acknowledges that they're a tribe and one that doesn't.
Yeah. I think that's a funny way to look at it, but I think that's very true.
Yeah. I'm reminded of, I'm not sure if you listen to it. I'm not really interested in dunking on like Sam Harris in particular, but he and Ezra Klein were talking about things like in-group tribal thinking, things like that. And Sam Harris is not a fan of his version of identity politics, whatever that means. That could be a whole other discussion in itself. Like, I just don't want to go down that route. But Sam in multiple podcasts and in this podcast was, just talking about how, it's bad to think tribally. We should just reason things based on what's good for some people, and for others, we shouldn't think of, groups of people like black people, white people, things like that, regardless of how society is treating those people. We should just reason our way. If I had to steel man it, like, reason through it abstractly, like through a pure veil of ignorance in a Rawlsian sense. And Ezra pushed back on him and said, I don't think you're above this sort of thinking. And Harris flat out denies it. And I think this is a common behavior among self-proclaimed skeptics. They'll say that I don't think tribally. I look at issues from all sides. I'm not tied to one particular group or anything, but I'm not even sure that's possible. And it's almost as if they think by being a critical thinker, they're above it. And I kind of see where they're coming from, because I like to think of myself as a critical thinker. And I know I do actually read articles from, the other side. And I look for all different sources, but I know that all those sources are being put through my filter in my perception.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it does start with perception. That's the thing that makes it so difficult for people to really even be aware of, because as we're reading the words, seeing the stimuli in front of us, it's already being filtered in a way that we're unaware of. And that's such an unnatural feeling, because it's not really like we have, free will and that whole thing. It's like, I think free will is more of an illusion. And it seems like I can read this article completely unbiased. In reality, our brain's already processing these words and weighting different things a little bit differently based on our identity, our worldview, our culture. That's going to bias just how we process things and the amount of attention we pay to certain arguments. So I think it's funny and counterintuitive to think that skeptics can actually be even more biased sometimes by not admitting that they have legitimate bias and vulnerability to irrational thought.
I'm wondering if you have the same experience as I do. A lot of the times, these quote unquote, maybe they're centrists, maybe they're just skeptics who are above it all, or at least they would identify that way. I don't care to. I'm not going to put them in a box, but all the time I'll talk about something like trans issues or Black Lives Matter or something that people will say PC culture has gone too far. And, maybe I will defend that to some extent. And when I get pushback from this sort of sphere, a lot of the time they'll say, "Oh, you're just acting on ideology." Like ideology is almost some buzzword. Like you are an ideologue for defending this. When it's like almost as if they're shoving ideology onto me and they're abstaining from it whatsoever. I'm not sure if you have the same experience of that.
Yeah,
maybe
similar.
a commenter on your blog. I know at least one that's kind of interesting.
So. Yeah, well, yeah, there's the comment section's always
don't look at the comments.
Yeah. I mean that's a whole other discussion, but yeah, I do think the idea of ideologies being something that only one side does relates way back to the football study where only one side has the penalty, like our team's not doing that, it's the other team. And in reality, with football, to go in the nuances of football, like holding, that the penalty of like grabbing each other is actually pretty subjective, because like I don't want to sports ball too much, but it can be very subjective. Like it's not something that one team or the other can obviously and clearly always be in the wrong. You can it's very easy to put your bias into it. So I just think that with ideology, oftentimes our best bet is to try to admit we have ideological bias. And I know that I do. And I know I have a more left-leaning bias. And I go into that with these discussions with more center or center-right people. I'm like, hey, here's my bias. And I just openly start with that. This is where I'm coming from. Here's how I've been exposed. These are the people I'm exposed to and what I regularly read. And I try to be like, tell me, your points. And we can try to just see each other's perspectives and hopefully learn from each other, even if we don't change each other's minds. But if you just shut down and be like, no, you're biased and I'm not, then that doesn't seem like to me a very productive conversation.
Yeah. And I know, I think I'm reading this paper through my own biases, because I am seeing some things, and I know I am, obviously, because we've already established this, but like I'm seeing parallels between like this study and some discourse today on the internet. Like there's a quote, I think it's the first quote from the Daily Princetonian, November 27th, 1951. So this is like almost 70 years ago. I'm just going to read a quick excerpt. Princeton, obviously the better team, had no reason to rough up Dartmouth. Looking at the situation rationally, we don't see why the Indians should make a deliberate attempt to cripple Dick Kazmaier or any other Princeton player. The Dartmouth psychology, however, is not rational itself.
Wow,
like,
that's
and
amazing.
It's like I'm seeing this, and it's like a complete absolution of like it's this appeal to I'm a rational thinker, you're not, you're wrong, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm just reading over that now, and that's incredible, and it kind of shows you how old these ideas are. Like this isn't new stuff that people are biased in these ways. Humans have been this way for a long time. And again, I think our best bet is to try to accept it and have as much as we can accept it. And I think it's a learned skill. I'd like to think that, at least. I know the research on that is a little new, as far as like some people study a concept called intellectual humility, which is the idea of admitting you're wrong, basically, and trying to see the other person's spot, not being so rigid in your opinion. But that's tough. I mean, no one wants we kind of have a gut reaction to not be wrong, because it makes us feel like we're stupid or less than. And I feel like if you can kind of frame your self-worth in a way that isn't so crippling to admit that you're wrong, it could be a helpful way to look at it.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I've heard some things here and there. It's probably good to talk about ways to try and overcome it, because then we can work more towards the truth. But I'm wondering if there's better ways to introduce fact patterns, evidence in a way that doesn't that you don't introduce it like, well, this group says this group says that chocolate ice cream is the best, but if you look at this evidence about vanilla ice cream, it actually has this protein that helps hair growth or something. I don't know. Just insert science fact here. Like, don't introduce facts in a team sports type of way.
Right. And there is a lot of research on that and trying to really suss out those nuances. And one body of research certainly looks at framing and also the idea of so not making people defensive, not bringing up the immediate team sports. Absolutely. That's going to shut people down because that's the first thing they're going to think about. And there's a lot of interesting political research on how you give to this person the same fact and say it's from a Democrat or a Republican, and they'll interpret it completely different depending if it's on their team or not. So the framing is important to try to make it not so polarizing from the get-go. And what's interesting to that kind of supports that narrative of not wanting it to be overly threatening is there's a lot of research looking at how self-esteem plays a role in being more likely to accept identity-threatening information. And there's a research experimentally inducing self-esteem. So you make people think about a time basically when they felt good about themselves. They write about it, they reflect on it, they're in a little bit more positive mood. Implicitly, they don't even really realize it because they're just writing about, like, basically it's a list of values that are important to them that are non-political. So like maybe like your family, like, oh, I'm writing about how I'm a good father and this makes me feel good, and it's another source of self-worth. And then after you do that, you expose them to some facts about maybe climate change being evidence. There's evidence for climate change. And it actually reduces the amount of polarization in their response to it if they were anti-climate change before. Because the theory is like, well, they're better able to absorb the information. And again, going back to even to the basic consistency idea, they're elevated in one way, their sense of self and self-esteem. So they're better able to handle this information that's a little bit more identity threatening, and they can process it a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and so this is the second time you've mentioned consistency, and so I'm wondering if the consistency is playing into this team sports thing as well, because if you have this established fact pattern that this group of people tends to be right. It's consistent with that fact pattern that things in the future will be right, or like if somebody introduces more information that's more reliable, and there's a sense in which that's not the worst thing in the world, because like I'm going to trust the New York Times over InfoWars, something like that. I recognize there's also in-group biases between normal people who read the New York Times and conspiracy theorists who watch the InfoWars. But like, I think I have good reason to believe the New York Times is better than InfoWars. But I'm wondering if that does tie into the team group bias. Like if you're against SJWs and they get it wrong all the time, then any pro SJW fact, you're instantly like, why is this wrong? This is wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, it's exerting more cognitive effort to try to think of the outgroup that's usually wrong, that they could be right. That's just, again, if you want to talk about evolutionary theory, the brain's exerting more effort. So why would your brain, something that requires a lot of energy and is constantly using up energy, why would it try to do something that's going to exert more effort and also potentially hurt the tribe if you go against what the social boundaries around that? So yeah, absolutely. I think it makes it so hard when people are so used to, this is my side, that's right, that side's wrong, and the facts, you go into it automatically looking to tear the argument down instead of seeing when it could potentially be correct.
Right. And I don't pretend to be above that either. Like, and I argue with people on the internet way too much. And I'll admit, like, I have that mentality a lot of the time. Like, somebody posts article and I'm like, oh, why is this wrong? You know,
Yeah.
so I know that's something I should curtail, but
it's hard. It takes extra effort. Like you have to have an intrinsic motivation to do it. Like and that's why I think about this a lot. How do we incentivize that? Because again, like there's a psychological incentive to not do that and a social incentive to not do it. So I'm thinking loosely there could be like a shift in social norms where we reward that kind of like more thoughtful, careful approach to analyzing different ideas. But that's just a very slow way to go about it because it's not popular and you're not going to get as much attention having this really boring, nuanced Twitter debate as opposed to having like a zinger.
If I have to give credit to this center sphere that's above tribal thinking, I think that might actually be their ultimate goal. Like act and behave in a way that's calm and rational so that other people latch onto it and learn how to have respectful conversations. I think they have without going into it too much, I think they have a little bit too much faith that it'll work. And I think it allows current injustices to be ignored, if that makes sense.
But it does make sense. And I would agree with that because I interact with them sometimes and I don't think that they're always wrong. I think sometimes they make some really good points. And I think it's important for the left to be critical of itself, or the right to be critical. Any group should try to engage in self-criticism, just like individuals should engage in self-criticism too. I think it's healthy and you learn stuff. So I think some of their aspirations are admirable, like you do, but you're right, or I would agree with you. Maybe this is my bias, but I think some of their approaches to focus so much on the civility and sometimes they miss the nuances that are underneath just rational dialogue above all else. Like sometimes there's other components about very severe power imbalances that really mess things up, that makes it really hard to have civil and equal discourse. And just the idea that generally the whole battleground of ideas is something that's very frustrating to me because the best ideas don't necessarily rise to the top all the time. In fact, sometimes really bad ideas rise to the top because they fit into our biases and they're very simple, bigoted ideas that people can latch onto. We might have just saw a very good example of this in the recent presidential election.
Yeah,
of just the quick pithy. Yeah,
that's my go-to case. If the best ideas always win out, Donald Trump, he had like 10 debates where he looked like an asshole.
Right, but think of the words that he used. Build the wall. Very simple, like tribalistic kind of mechanisms that tapped into these very strong biases that we have: anti-immigrant bias that a lot of Americans have, anti-Hillary Clinton bias. I mean, he just had very simple, like really unsophisticated ideas that allowed him to win. So clearly, the battle of ideas isn't a fair fight. I hope I can at least agree with more center people on that. They might say it's more fair or something, but I think if they can at least concede that we have a lot of instability in that battleground, that at least gives us something.
And also marketing exists. So if marketing exists, then you're able to sell bullshit. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think that's something that I've been pushing for a long time, and I think people get upset with that. Yeah, but one thing we can definitely agree on, this is a great segue, is that scientists are never involved in this tribal in-group, out-group thinking. They're always very rational about this. So
yeah, there's no issues with science. Once you're a scientist, all your biases go away. I think that's how it works.
I've actually seen some. It was very superficially civil, but I've seen some heated arguments at seminars and things like that. I think if the rational skeptic crowd actually attended like a science conference, like I'm sure I know there are a lot of scientists within that crowd, as like science does not belong to any one group, but it's just a fact that the population as a whole isn't mostly scientists, so most of that group isn't going to be scientists. And I think they might be surprised at how heated and political actual science is. I don't know if you have any experiences with that.
Yes, actually, pretty much my whole PhD. You always see it. It's everywhere. And not even the politics within departments, like even if you just ignore all that and just focus on the science, like the rational scientific skepticism at these conferences that theoretically should just be these very level-headed people looking at the data above all else. An example that I'll try not to give too many specifics to out anyone, but there is this sociological theory that's very popular, and people were critiquing it. Some people I know, and the creator of the theory became so defensive of the criticism and was just ignoring a lot of the points that people were bringing up. And eventually the creator of this theory was saying things like, well, you're just not understanding it correctly, and you're not interpreting it the right way that it should be. And then the people I know were like, well, if it's a theory, it shouldn't have to be interpreted. It should just be clear and concise. Like, that's the goal. And there's these holes in your theory that we think you should fix. And this person is like, no, you're wrong. They get really heated. There's this whole animosity, and then there's a whole conflict. So if the goal was really, I care about science and evidence, they should have been so super happy that, hey, someone helped me make my theory a little bit better. But instead it was like, damn, like I have my whole career based on this theory, and if I admit that I'm wrong, that's going to make me really look bad. I don't want to do that. So like that happens so much in science, and that's bias.
I think I can think of one example where that didn't happen. I think it was in the last year, somebody purported to disprove the backfire effect. I'm not going to comment on that. And the author of the original study was like, ooh, I want in on this.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting idea too, of the backfire effect being the theory. But even then,
it would have been ironic if it would have been
if they backfired themselves. Just to prove their own theory.
If somebody gave him evidence that the backfire effect didn't exist, and he doubled down.
Yeah. And then they use different framing and self-esteem manipulations to try to get them more likely to accept it.
If that happened, then I think that's paradoxical. Like, neither side would have a case. So.
That was interesting.
Yeah. So I want to get into diversity, particularly in science, but also with its relationship to internet skepticism and things like that. And just as a introduction, like, I know you are out as a queer person. You're bisexual. I would like to know your experience of inclusion in science conferences, science speakers. Like, if there's any bigotry that you witness or experience, like, or maybe something you noticed before and after you came out. Like, is there anything to that, even in something ostensibly as neutral as the science community?
Yeah, I don't think I personally have experienced any direct discrimination from it. I mean, I'm in sociology, so people are very accepting of LGBTQ. And so maybe that helps. And I'm also have other different social benefits being white and cis and stuff like that. So I think it does get tricky on like which aspect of your identity is more salient. If they can see it, that people don't know my sexual orientation when they look at me. So I think that makes it more tricky. The thing that I think's potentially interesting for minority groups in general is sometimes, as it relates to science, not even getting to the institution of science, but just science itself, because there are so few of different groups, like bisexuals are always underrepresented in studies because it's either gay or straight. And then bisexuals, usually there's not enough statistical power to include bisexuals, so they're not studied as much. Same with trans people, same with different minority groups that are racial categories that are really small. So that's something that I don't really directly experience, but I definitely notice, whether it's examples in class or in the literature. Whenever you're part of some sort of minority group, generally it's a little bit tougher for you to be studied, because usually it's white people, white middle class people are often the participants in these studies.
Right, and that actually affects our models of the objective facts, quote unquote. Like, if we're not studying a representative sample of the population, or we're not studying people affected by certain phenomena, then you're actually interfering with the objective facts by not having diverse samples. Like
sure, it skews your data. Like, you have more data for other groups and less data for these minority groups. So it definitely, and it can snowball on that, because if there's more research on, you know, heterosexual versus homosexual, then you can build on that literature and keep going and develop your theories and keep accumulating. So groups that can't even get like a good footing before they can be studied in future studies, it can cause problems for sure. And sometimes you don't even think about that. So some of the some other examples that just are clear biases in the literature, again, not even talking about the institutional stuff, but health research has not included a lot of reproductive issues until more recently. So when you had a lot of dudes studying this stuff, they didn't even really think about, like, if you look at the citations of women's health, it's gone up so much in the past 20 years, just because there's more women in the field, maybe, probably, I would say, but also just the cultural differences on how we are more accepting of you know, different women's rights and stuff like that, to incorporate them. So those are clear examples we can see that actually impacts the science before we even get into anything else.
Right, and I think if we're, you know, as people who enjoy and promote scientific skepticism, a lot of people's foundational principles are, you know, the facts are the facts, and we need to look at things rationally and objectively at how nature behaves. And just a fact of the matter is not implementing these steps it actually interferes with that foundational principle. So
right.
That is a good way to at least make steps towards interacting with people who think diversity is a cultural Marxist takeover plot. So yeah. I do know, like, I went to, you know, I go to science conferences. One of the ones I went to is like this big chemical engineering one. It's a national conference, but there were actually lots of international speakers, just thousands and thousands of speakers. And one day they had an event for queer chemical engineers. Like, I just walked by a poster and it said LGBTQ chemical engineering students attending this conference.
Cool.
And like, every time I see something like that in like skepticism or atheism, I see a huge backlash. Is like, well, I thought we were just people. Like, everybody's the same. Like, everybody's treated the same. Why are we putting everybody into boxes? And I see almost none of that in science circles. It's sort of like, oh, they have their thing. Okay, that's fine. Like, they move on with their day, and it really confused. I'm sure there is some of that whining and moaning that I don't see. So to be fair, but like, you know, these are people whose living relies on thinking rationally and skeptically, and they don't necessarily interact with that in the same way that people who want to be, who value that, you know, who have this scientific skepticism virtue signaling, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think I've had a similar experience being in both science and skepticism circles. It always is baffling to me to see backlash to the seemingly most non-controversial statements. Like, we have a harassment policy for an atheism conference, and it's like super bland. It's like, don't assault people, don't harass them. If anyone's bothering you, you can report them to the president or whoever's leading the conference. And those kinds of kind of boilerplate harassment policies are also in science conferences, and it's always I've never seen someone attack those to the degree that skepticism people do. And I wonder if it's probably so many factors that go into that. Maybe it's the whole thing about, again, identifying as a skeptic too strongly, and you think oh well, we're all just humans, why don't we just why do we even need to have these different spaces or different policies? And it just totally misses that, yes, ideally it'd be great if everyone just saw each other as equal humans, but we don't live in that society. People still have these biases, and bigotry still exists. So that's why these different spaces and events are necessary. Yeah. So, yeah.
I almost wonder, I know that the science community definitely isn't a post-racial community or anything, but it's definitely a lot less white than mainstream skepticism. So I wonder if that is a factor too. Like, just these people are introduced and it's like, oh, okay, they're also scientists.
Right. I think so. This is my thoughts on the whole diversity as a kind of like a numbers game. Like, people talk about like, oh, well, we don't want to have like quotas or something. And I'm like, well, first off, that's a straw man. I don't think people are asking for quotas to be filled at like professors, where like you're not gonna, at least I'm not familiar with that. I don't know if you've seen like scientists or people say like, we're gonna fire all the white guys to make it more equal. Like, I don't think I've seen that too often, or really ever. But
I say that, but only to be edgy. So I should stop that because I'm playing team sports.
Yeah, well,
I'll stop that. But sure.
I think because science is a little bit more balanced as far as gender and race, because skepticism's pretty bad. Like, it's super white male. Science, especially different subfields. So like biology, the gender is pretty even. Social science, it's actually more female. So there's and that bleeds over to like neuroscience and computational psychology, some stuff that's like more hard science when there's more numbers, I guess. Like, it's not really, that's a whole other discussion. But the idea is there is a lot more women, minorities, of all different kinds in science than I think there is in this, really tiny skepticism community. And it's kind of an effect of the more people that are similar attract people like them. That's basic homophily principle for sociology. Homophily is just the idea that we tend to prefer people that are like us in different categories, whether it's a superficial category like how we look, or political preference, stuff like that. It's just kind of a bias we have. So if we have all these people that look like us, or white dudes, it's going to reinforce the idea that that community is for white dudes. And from my discussions from women and people of color in both science and skepticism communities, they tell me the frustrating part, one of the most frustrating parts of being a woman or a woman of color, is that there's so few of us. So it perpetuates the issue that we're seen as the outsiders, that they're the only person in their math class or computer science class that's a woman or black. And it just instantly puts them as the other. And we talked about team sports before, as far as how quickly we delineate social lines. So it's not so much that I want to force, I don't want to force quotas or anything like that. I'm actually against that. And I think it wouldn't be helpful. And it would cause backlash that just ultimately wouldn't be productive. I think we should try to reduce as many barriers as we can to get as many people in science, so we elevate the amount of people in each group as best we can, so they don't feel so much like outsiders, and they don't feel like they have to be the only person in their class because that subject's not for someone like them.
Right. You get this impression that this is what a scientist is. And it tends to be the case that when I think science or scientist, I'm thinking, an old white dude. Right. So But I might disagree with you because I will not rest until every professor in my department is a non-binary person of color. So,
all right. Well, we disagree on that, so
we can debate later. But that brings up on June 6th, Nature, which is like one of the premier journals you want to get in. Like, if you get into Nature as a grad student, like that's like a holy grail.
Yeah.
You know, it's high impact, very well cited and well read. And they just put in an editorial earlier in June talking about science benefiting from diversity. And I read through it. It's not even, it is one of the most, I describe it as milk toast. Like it's not bad. It's just like, you know, it gives a few reasons why diversity is good and saying diversity is good in science. Like, I'm like, okay, how could this outrage anyone? I forgot this is 2018. I just saw it being torn to shreds.
Right.
You know, a very particular crowd got into it. I'm going to read, I don't want to name the person because I don't want to engage in dunking culture or outrage culture. But here's a sample of a figurehead who said this. Imagine if the Vatican said that institutions have an ethical duty to make science more Christian. This is no different. Zero difference. None.
Zero difference. None. Wow.
And I'm over here like saying, I want to open up science to more people. And I don't know. And this person says, imagine if we wanted to close off science to only Catholics or something like that. And I'm just like,
it's hard. It's hard because you're starting at such different foundations to even like connect meaningfully. Because I engaged a little bit on Twitter about that particular Nature post. And again, I don't want to dunk on anyone either. I was trying my best to see their perspective. All right, why don't they like this? It seems so obvious to me. And maybe I'm missing something. Maybe it's not so obvious. So I go back and forth with a couple of these people that were not on board with the Nature article. And eventually it started to shift into postmodernism, which
my bingo square. So
yeah, right, exactly. And I think that's it's kind of a bias in itself that there's this hyper focus on like this very tiny subfield of sociology, which is just so bizarre to me in itself. But it was so frustrating because they were like, yeah, the reason we don't like this essentially is because the postmodernist Marxists are taking over. And I'm like, okay, like, you know, I'm like, okay, like let's put that aside. What about the
you disavowed socialism, like, right? You're not a socialist anymore, and you're like, well, I can't be a Marxist.
Yeah,
I think this is a good idea.
Yeah, I'm not a Marxist. I wouldn't say I'm a socialist either. So like I was like, okay, you know, I'm hearing what you're saying about this stuff. And I also think diversity is good. And then they're like, well, you know, but postmodernism. I'm like, no, we don't want to talk about postmodernism anymore. Like, tell me why having more different types of brains in science is a bad thing. And they're like, well, you know, obviously everyone in science. I'm like, well, then what's your issue? They're like, well, postmodernism. And I'm like, just trying to expand from this hyper focus of their way to kind of justify picking on the Nature article as this like grand conspiracy that relates to postmodernism that's taking over. And I'm like, I don't think it is. And it was just really hard to have a middle ground there. Or really not even a middle ground, just an understanding. I feel like they couldn't really understand where I was coming from because I even included some papers that said cultural diversity helps group performance. When you have people from different cultural backgrounds, it's actually a good thing because they bring different skills. And the idea of an identity then is just kind of a collection of your cultural influences and how it can shape how you approach different problems. Because there's tons of research on how cultural differences impacts how we solve problems. If you come from a more collectivist culture versus a more individualist culture, you solve problems differently, and that's a good thing. So the same people that are against or are so supportive of ideological diversity are also the same people that are like, well, I don't want identity diversity. even though the identity is really ideological diversity, is just kind of a different, broader kind of perspective.
Right. And I will say postmodernists would also be another viewpoint. So if they want viewpoint diversity,
right.
I don't consider myself a postmodernist, though you might call me a postmodernist sympathizer. I'm definitely not a fan of like obscurantist text, things like that. But we could go into that, but I think some of it actually does explore the philosophy of how cultural influences and power dynamics can shift the way we think. Like, we don't logically, rationally think in a certain way. And it might, in fact, tie into some of the science we were talking about earlier, though, just things like that.
Right. It does. At least in my experience, when I talk to postmodernists, I'm like, okay, so what you're saying basically is people have biases. Right. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, well, I study bias from like an empirical approach. And like, that's cool. Like, we agreed. I'm like, oh, okay. So then I think one of the biggest issues is the terminology and the obscure concepts and theoretical approaches, because a lot of times postmodernists will use really tricky language, to put it loosely and lightly. The idea that like there's greater objectivity, like they'll say something like that. I'm like, wait a minute, I don't know if I'd use that term, and that people have like a different way of knowing. Like those kinds, that's like a triggering word. there is that sort of cultural relativism and moral relativism, and that does interfere with science sometimes. So I agree with that too. But they are focused on like power structures, like people in power do get to create the narrative, and that should not be controversial, and that's a very common postmodernist talking point. And I think one thing I would agree with is this, a lot of anti-diversity people promote meritocracy. Just an idea that if you do the job right, then you should get hired for the job, or you should be promoted, things like that. And I think they seem to think that's where we already are. Obama got elected president. We had a black president, so we already have it. And I don't think that's true. I don't think they'll bend over backwards trying to justify how things already are. Let me quote another thing. That call for diversity from Nature cited a different Nature editorial that actually gave a lot of evidence for how diversity improves or problems within diversity. And I'll just give a little extra, one statistic that jumped out at me. Let's see. Chemistry, by comparison, awards 17% of bachelor's and 11% of doctoral degrees to these groups, meaning African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Native Americans. The proportion in physics has barely risen over the past 15 years, while the percentage of U.S. university-age students from minorities has grown by 18%. That's just an example of the proportion in the population growing, and the proportion in science not. And if you believe we are in a meritocratic system, you have to believe something absurd, like that population is just getting stupider in proportion to how many people live in America, or something like that. Like, it makes no sense. It's really hard to justify it. And that's a great point. And that's what I mean about the idea of not feeling like such an outsider. If you're like, okay, well, I know there's less black people in the United States, but if I'm the only black person I ever see like giving talks at a science conference, that's way less than the proportion of black people I see in in my state, So it it causes issues when it's so disproportionate, because you feel like you're such an outsider, and other people are going to treat you like an outsider whether they know it or not, because that's unconscious bias that happens sometimes, and it's something we can work on, but it still is an issue. And it's just worth talking about. Like the H article is just like, hey, let's be aware of this stuff and try our best to not have these biases, or if we see something happening, speak up, but just to try to knock down those barriers. It seems like such a simplistic kind of straightforward, milk toast, to use your terminology, approach.
Yeah, it wasn't even saying, I don't think it even said we need to implement quotas or anything, but and again, to make a comparison, skepticism is so white, like it's almost as if like we're not tackling our biases head on. Like maybe I think if you surround yourself with more of those people, you tend to see, I would see more people of color in my paradigmatic image of what a scientist is, and I'd be more likely to seek out and listen to what those people say. And I think it might just be a visibility problem, and I think it's another reason why representation is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah. It's hard. It's really hard to see, because again, I was trying to see the arguments against it, and in my time that I spent engaging with a few of them, it just went off into this narrow focus of postmodernism instead of focusing on the really general, specific points that were brought up.
The objective facts.
Yeah, like yeah. It's yeah.
It is really interesting. Before we wrap up, like in the next 5 minutes, I have noticed that you and I both also agree that quote unquote like SJWs can go too far. I'm generally pro people speaking at campuses, unless I don't think once Milo started harassing people on stage, like that's just I think that's very good reason to disbar somebody from speaking. But like things like that, I do think a lot of allies shut down conversation when they could not. But at the same time, I see a lot of behavior that I see a lot of signaling that behavior is bad, and yet I get that all the time, just like what you're describing it with. You're just trying to talk about the facts and the science of the case, and all they're focusing on is postmodernism and SJWs trying to take down white men or something like that.
Right. Absolutely. And it's interesting to see the parallels between the two, and how they both fall into the it's okay when I do it. And I think that's certainly an issue. And there are certainly instances where I think people on the SJW crowd engage in behavior that I think could be counterproductive for the goal that they're seeking. When we look at just how people respond to becoming really defensive, and if it's in a certain situation that is more of a moderate setting, and you go into it and make it more polarizing and like kind of elevate to the polarization when there wasn't there. I think stuff like that, just like from a social psych perspective, makes it more, if the goal is to make it easier for people to adopt new beliefs, that certain behaviors we know don't work as well. So all that said, I think so much of the SJW problem and the campus problems are just overblown. And it's kind of like this fear mongering that you pick out a select group of instances that I even would agree with are problematic, to use that word for this. And I'm like, all right, I agree that particular campus incident and that one. I'm like, okay, so that's like 3 instances in the last 5 years. Where's the systemic problem of Marxists taking over the world? I still don't get it. I still don't see where you're coming from. I see specific instances that you're using to justify a very wide sweeping narrative, but I don't see the evidence to connect all of those dots.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think there are ways to organically shift the discourse in a positive way. I think one of them is creating more visibility and representation. In fact, you know, now that you're saying you haven't had much like harassment or you don't see it and you have lots of privileges, I agree with that. I should get into maybe I should see in the future if I can, you know, talk to women or people of color scientists, maybe in the hard sciences, and see if they have a perspective on this that you don't. But I think visibility is really important. And if I had to cap it off, I think introducing and promoting intellectual humility is a good thing. And maybe not stoking the outrage culture as much as we can while still being able to critique the other side, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like some pretty good goals to me.
Okay. Is there anything else you think is important that we didn't touch on before we go, or is this good?
I feel like this is a pretty good place to wrap up. I feel like we covered a lot of different areas, and maybe we could talk for hours on these subjects. So
absolutely, yeah, I know. Yeah, no, it's always good to talk to you, and I hope we get to meet up again someday. That'll be good.
Yeah,
cool. If you know, my platform is just starting out, so you're not going to get too many hits from me, but all the formalities aside, if people are going to find you, where should they look?
Sure. Well, I still have my Patheos blog, According to Matthew, where I write about politics, religion, sometimes science. And I used to have the podcast with that, but as we talked about, it kind of took a break, and I'm going to be starting a new podcast. I'm still working out the name and specifically logistics, but it's going to be more science oriented. So you can just Google me. My name's pretty uncommon, so you'll find what I've been writing about or the social media. I'm on Twitter, and Facebook is just my name, Matthew Facciani. So I usually share a lot of science stuff and stuff like that. But yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on. It was a lot of fun to talk about this stuff and catch up.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you name your podcast Galaxy Brain Rational Matthew Facciani Talks to People, I think that would be that's just my entry. You don't have to take it, but I think it's a pretty good one.
All right, so, yeah, we'll consider it.
All right, thanks so much.
Thank you.